There are stories that make you smile, and then there are stories that make you feel. The ones that begin with a single look, the kind that reaches deep beneath the skin and wakes something that's been waiting in silence. Where the pull isn't rushed or reckless, but so strong it feels like destiny itself is guiding every breath and every touch. Where a night doesn't just burn with passion, it stretches time, turning hours into a lifetime's worth of emotion. Where even when the fire dies down, the warmth never fades, because it wasn't just desire, it was the beginning of something real. If you've ever longed to be seen, wanted, and loved in a way that rewrites who you are, then welcome. This is where love isn't just told, it lives, breathes, and lingers in every heartbeat. It was never meant to be anything more than an escape, a quiet retreat from the noise and the hollow ache that had started growing in the spaces no one else could see. The kind of loneliness that didn't always shout, but whispered into every quiet minute, every empty chair, every night spent pretending sleep came easily. Packing that small suitcase felt like taking control, even if only for a brief pause. The plan was simple: disappear for a while, breathe different air, let time blur until the ache dulled. The sun felt different there, not warmer, just more honest. It exposed everything it touched in the softest way, leaving no shadows to hide behind. Sitting alone with bare feet touching damp sand, it didn't feel like healing yet, but it felt like possibility. The waves came in soft rhythms that synced with a heartbeat that had forgotten how to care about its own existence. That rhythm swirled around quietly until it softened the edges of the mind, letting thoughts drift without resistance. Eyes were closed for a while, not to sleep, but to listen, to prove that life still made a sound when no one else was around. Crashing water, rustling palm leaves, distant seagulls, laughter somewhere far enough not to sting. Then something shifted. The instinct to open them came out of nowhere, and in that moment, everything before and after bent into something unexpected. There he was, far enough not to be intrusive, close enough to be seen, not just seen in the way most people look at things, but seen like a secret being gently discovered. There was no smile yet, but something about his gaze felt shaped by understanding. It wasn't bold, but it wasn't hesitant either. That look didn't carry questions, it carried recognition, as if somehow an unnamed ache wasn't just visible, it was shared. There should have been awkwardness. Instead, something calmer rushed in. Shoulders didn't tense, breath didn't catch, loneliness didn't leap to defend itself. Instead, there was an urge to stay exactly where the moment had placed everything. There was no sense of being measured, no attempt to draw a story on a face. Only a quiet acknowledgement that something had shifted simply by meeting a pair of eyes under the sun. The next second stretched. The world seemed to hush around them without asking why. There was no rush toward words, no awkward scramble to fill silence, just simple being. He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. Instead, there was a slow tilt to his head, an unspoken signal of kindness, the kind that holds space rather than pushes into it. A pulse jumped gently beneath skin that had been too still for far too long. For a brief moment, fear whispered it might be too much to return that gaze, but the thought dissolved almost as soon as it formed, because this wasn't danger, it was connection. Unexpected, yes, but it felt older than the moment itself. Legs moved without thinking, just slightly, and shoulders relaxed further. Eyes softened, not out of choice, but because the heart demanded it. He stepped closer, not enough to impose, but just enough to share air more intentionally. His presence carried something so steady, it became impossible to remember why loneliness had ever been allowed to settle. Before any greeting passed, there was acceptance in his expression, a softness that welcomed rather than questioned, as if he understood that sometimes love begins without a plan, without a disguise, without perfect timing. When words did come, they were few. A simple hello. Inside that hello was a warmth that wrapped itself gently around a fragile heart. It wasn't the kind of warmth that scorched, it was the kind that thawed. Under that open sky, two human souls began weaving an invisible thread between them, not with declarations, not with dramatics. With tiny gestures, the subtle lean of a shoulder, the relaxed curve at the corner of a mouth, the natural closing of distance that didn't feel dared but destined. Conversation unfolded slowly, like petals opening only when touched by sunlight. Each word brought him nearer without steps. Each response felt lighter, freer, as if years of weight were dissolving into the breeze. He didn't ask for stories he could judge. He asked for stories he could hold gently. Every time he listened, it felt like being wrapped in safety, the kind that tells a heart it doesn't need to wear armor. As laughter began to surface between sentences, it wasn't loud or sharp. It was soft, slightly surprised, reaching upward like a vine that had found something to grow toward. What started as an escape from emptiness was slowly becoming something completely different. Return to the very place that emptiness had forced into hiding. Eventually, he sat beside her in the sand, not touching, just close enough that the warmth of his body hummed like a heartbeat outside her own. It felt unfamiliar but natural, a reminder that intimacy isn't always built from touch, it's often born from presence. There were no promises made, no futures imagined, only that moment, pure, raw, real. The sun tilted westward, painting the sea in golden ribbons. Shadows lengthened, but nothing about it felt like an ending. They watched the sky together, quietly knowing that something real had taken root, not loudly but deeply. And when fingers finally reached for fingers, it wasn't desperate. It was gentle and sure, as if that touch had already existed long before either was brave enough to close the final inch. Nothing was solved, but something was changed. Loneliness no longer felt like an unbreakable cage. It felt like a season that might be fading, and all because two eyes dared not to judge but to see. Some hearts meet not to fill a void, but to awaken what has always been waiting. It started so quietly a look held a second too long, a smile that felt warmer than it should, and then a touch that sent something rushing through the veins that hadn't pulsed in years. There had been a time when desire was effortless, when eyes followed, when lips parted without hesitation. But over time, that effortless magic had dimmed, replaced by routines and responsibilities that slowly stole the spark. Until that night, when a younger hand brushed lightly against the skin, not by accident, but with full intention. There was a hunger in that touch, not wild, but sure, and something long asleep stirred unexpectedly. It wasn't just attraction, it was recognition, a reminder, a whisper inside that said you are still wanted, that you are still seen. There was no pretending, no performance, just the raw surprise of being desired again, not for what had been, but for what was still here. Confidence, once lost somewhere between years and disappointments, blinked awake. What began as a simple brush of fingertips became a slow surrender, the warmth of his palm against a wrist, the way his thumb circled the pulse point like a secret signal. It wasn't loud, it wasn't staged, but it was powerful in a way that shook everything. The body responded before thought could interfere, leaning in, heart stuttering in disbelief, breath catching because even air wanted to slow down to feel this moment. When his lips found bare skin, there was nothing frantic in it. It was the opposite, careful, reverent, meant, as though that single kiss was placed not to claim, but to awaken, and awaken it did. Hidden beneath layers of years lived, and walls built stood a woman who had forgotten what it felt like to burn from the inside out. But flame met flame, and longing fierce, real, unstoppable surged forward. It wasn't just the thrill of his youth, although that did something dangerous and sweet. It was the way he looked, truly looked with eyes that said, "I want you exactly as you are." That kind of gaze strips away all the armor. It calls to the softness underneath, the softness guarded so tightly for fear of being hurt again. But suddenly, that softness wanted to be touched, wanted to be felt again. Bodies moved closer, guided not by planning but by need. Every inch of skin that met another seemed to say, "Remember this." The heat between them had nothing to prove, it simply existed, bold and undeniable. His voice close to the ear, breath hot and honest, ignited sparks along skin that had forgotten how sensitive it could be. Fingers threaded into hair, nails dragged lightly across his shoulder. Each moment pulled a little more of the woman she thought she'd lost back to the surface. And when he kissed deeply, slowly, carefully, with hunger and tenderness in equal measure, something inside cracked open wide. There was no more holding back. Passion surged. Her hips moved with his as though they had always known how. The entire world narrowed down to touch and breath and heat. Yet somehow, even as desire flared, there was peace. A peace that came from feeling chosen, wanted, valued. Clothes slipped away. But it wasn't the bearing of flesh that mattered, it was the bearing of spirit. Wrapped in youth, strength, and reverence, he took his time. Every moment of closeness was cherished, as though each new inch of skin revealed was a gift he couldn't believe was his to taste. She felt beautiful again, powerful, alive. As his hands explored with a kind of wonder, she found herself arching not because she wanted to be seen, but because she felt safe enough to let go. Every moan, every shiver, every gasp was honest. And when their bodies finally came together slowly at first, sinking into each other with that exquisite pressure that makes the spine curl and the throat tremble, there was no doubt left. This wasn't a fling. This was a reclaiming of life, of womanhood, of desire itself. He moved inside her like he had always belonged there, not taking, not rushing, just joining, meeting every movement with an answering motion. When she tightened around him, it wasn't just pleasure. It was gratitude that he would gift her this rediscovery, that he would show her something she thought had gone forever still burned so brightly. She came undone beneath him with a quiet cry that filled the dark, and he held her as if she might shatter, pressing his lips to her temple, whispering things she never knew she longed to hear. Even when the waves of aftermath trembled through her body, he didn't let go. He wrapped himself around her back, breathing against her neck, letting silence speak everything their words could not. And long after the peak of desire faded, something continued to glow, something fierce, something unforgettable, because what he unlocked was more than passion. He reignited a belief in her own worth, her own beauty, her right to feel wanted, deeply and completely. Some touches don't just spark pleasure. They bring parts of you back to life. The nights we spent there never whispered, they roared, softly and unafraid, like the waves that crashed just a few feet away from where our bodies first found their rhythm. The sand was still warm from the day, grains clinging to damp skin, as though even the earth wanted to keep us that way, tangled, breathless, lost in something bigger than both of us. Nothing about those nights felt safe or careful. They were wild in the way only the heart understands, reckless but true, tender but blazing, sacred in a way you don't dare speak aloud. Bare feet sank deeper with every step taken toward him. The darkness wrapped around our figures, but the moon laid itself across his shoulders like silver armor. He looked like danger and home at once. I remember how fingers threaded into hair as if to anchor us both against how hard the world spun in that moment. His kisses were salt, bright and full of hunger, every one tasting like the ocean, bracing yet addictive. We never spoke much at first. Words would have ruined the spell. There was an urgency in the way mouths met, like two storms colliding in midair. And yet in the middle of that intensity, everything felt strangely peaceful, as though this chaos was the calm, as though we had wandered our entire lives just to land here, under a half-drunk moon and sky full of stars that watched unblinking. Hands explored without shame, tracing sweat, slick skin, memorizing new maps made of collarbones and heartbeats. Waves crashed just behind us, spraying us with mist whenever we pulled too close to the water's edge. I swear the ocean conspired with us, its tide creeping higher, daring us to surrender more. Every kiss went a bit deeper, every breath hitched a little harder, every connection grew more sacred by the minute. Nothing dared interrupt that wanting, the kind that came not from loneliness, but from recognition. Something inside had finally cracked wide open. Somewhere in between laughter that tripped out between moans and whispering sighs, there came a moment when everything slowed, his forehead against mine, noses brushing, both of us stunned by how fierce and fragile it felt to finally be seen like this. My toes dug into the sand behind me as his hands framed my face, thumb brushing along my bottom lip like he was memorizing the exact curve of it. It wasn't just touch, it was worship, it was wonder. Because when he looked at me then, I knew he wasn't just looking at my body, he was seeing the soul living underneath it. We stayed out long after the moon should have told us to crawl back to reality, but reality didn't exist there. Only crashing water, bright stars, tangled limbs, whispered shocks of heat that made the breath catch and flutter. He lifted me once, spinning slowly, my skirt fanning around my thighs as I wrapped arms around his neck, and gave in to every instinct that ever begged to be free. Every kiss felt like surrender wrapped in defiance, as if daring the universe to let something this rare actually stay. There was a point where we lay back in the sand, chests heaving, fingers tracing constellations across each other's skin like we were trying to write our names into one another. That was when it shifted from wildness to something unbearably tender. He pressed his palm over my heart not to claim, but to feel. I covered his hand with mine, sealing the warmth between us while the wind tugged our hair forward. A laugh left his throat, low and soft, like he almost couldn't believe how deep this reached. I understood. I couldn't believe it either. The night was alive, devouring us slowly in the most gentle, brutal way. Every kiss from that point forward didn't rush, it lingered, savored, promised. Lips against my ear whispered things not meant to last forever. Yet somehow, I knew they would echo through me for the rest of my life. The ocean's rhythm matched ours like a steady drum. He pulled me closer until even breathing hurt in the sweetest way. Every wave that broke behind us felt like a blessing. Every moment stretched into the next with no clear ending, just undying, burning presence. By the time dawn threatened to wash away the darkness, we were still their sand, coated salt, marked, wrapped in each other's arms, as though letting go would split the earth in two. Light bled slowly over the horizon, soft pink mixing with bruised purple. I looked at his face glowing in the first rays, realizing my body would carry this night the way skin carries scars, permanent, unforgettable. As he traced my cheek with one last lingering touch, his expression said everything words couldn't. Even when we finally stood and brushed off the sand, something stayed, something warm and eternal beneath the ribs. And long after we left that beach, after life turned noisy and ordinary again, his kiss still tasted of salt and danger and destiny. Because some nights are not made to be forgotten, they are made to live on inside the soul. It was supposed to be nothing more than borrowed time sun, soaked mornings, laughter scattered like shells across golden sand, and nights held together by the promise that it would all end without consequence. The heart behaved carefully at first, pretending not to feel too much, pretending that the sound of footsteps in the hallway or the taste of wine on lips meant nothing more than vacation sweetness. Yet even in the beginning, there was a tenderness that didn't fit the script of something temporary. It showed up in the quiet moments, the way a hand brushed away wind, tangled hair, the way eyes searched the face beside them as though already memorizing every line. There was a softness in the way each day flowed into the next. The laughter grew warmer, slower, rooted. Evenings carried conversations that stretched far beyond the usual small talk of strangers passing time. Stories were shared that most people hold close, the kind collected over years and only offered to those who matter. The heart tried to ignore how gently it began to lean, how easily it found comfort. One night changed everything. There was music somewhere in the background, low and distant, mixed with the whisper of waves folding across the shore. The two sat close, knees brushing under the table, knowing the end was near, and yet neither moved away. Words began circling, the kind that aren't meant to be spoken when endings are supposed to feel clean. You feel like home. The silence that followed was soft but heavy, like breath caught in the throat. Suddenly everything was different. This wasn't just about sand and sunsets anymore. This was about the way palms fit together too naturally, the way sighs slipped free when lips met in the dark, as if letting go could save the moment from passing too quickly. That night, bodies drew close not only because desire demanded it, but because something deeper insisted that closeness meant safety. Each movement carried intention. It wasn't the wild urgency of fleeting pleasure, it was something slower, more reverent. Fingers traced outlines of someone they hadn't realized they'd waited for. Every kiss tasted like a prayer. In the hush between heartbeats came the words not meant to be spoken, promises whispered against skin. Don't let this end. Stay. Forever. It wasn't loud. It wasn't reckless, but it shook the foundation of everything that had begun as something casual. The flames that had once been expected to burn brief and bright now glowed deeper, reaching the places only love can reach. By morning, something irreversible had taken root. Sunlight spread across tangled sheets and sleepy smiles, and with it came a truth too powerful to ignore. This was no longer just a passing fling. The heart had moved without permission, carrying everything with it: hope, fear, longing. What had been meant to end now begged for a beginning, and when it was time to leave, there were no grand declarations or tears in crowded airports, just a quiet pact, eyes holding each other with the weight of everything their lips couldn't say in public spaces. A final squeeze of hands, not goodbye, but a promise to return, a promise to fight for a chance at forever. Distance did not cool what that night had ignited. Instead, memories became anchors. They wrote, they called, they sent small pieces of themselves wrapped in envelopes, photographs, dried flowers, words scribbled in haste but soaked in devotion. They planned return trips. They counted days instead of dreaming of new vacations. The fling had turned into the center of every thought, and every heartbeat whispered the same truth. Some loves weren't built in slow seasons of life, but struck like lightning and forever changed everything they touched. Months later, the moment of return arrived. Standing in the same place where it began, the embrace felt like exhaling after holding breath for too long. There was relief. There was certainty. There was no question anymore about whether it had been temporary or real. When passion turns into a promise of forever, it doesn't happen in grand gestures or loud declarations. It happens in quiet vows made in dark rooms, in the trembling hope of whispered words, in the way a heart knows it has finally found where it belongs. If this story stirred something deep inside, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because here, every story is a pulse you can feel, and the next heartbeat is waiting for you.